All right, so now we turn to Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. Um, in physical classrooms at this point, I often say, well, Beauvoir's a feminist, and so this is our reading that we're going to do on feminism, and I say a few other things. And then I ask people to raise their hands if they're a feminist. So let's go ahead and do that now, our digital version of it, and just pause the recording now and think about whether you're a feminist or not. And just simply, it's going to be a yes or no, but give it some thought, okay? So if we were in a physical classroom right now and I asked that, experience has shown that there'll either be in a normal sized classroom, there'll be as few as, like two hands, not very many. And there will be as many sometimes as about a third of the class. But it's usually somewhere closer to the 2 students out of 20 or 30 students, depending on the room. Much more often than it's about 7 or 10 in the 20 to 30 size classroom. Okay. Now, my next step is this, and you'll do this one as well. You're like, okay, but this is how philosophy works, right? We'll always ask, but what is a blank, right? So Socrates says, but what is truly good? What is justice? What is the beautiful? Descartes says, but what is certainty, right? He just says, but what is art really? Is it about the artist's feelings or is it about something deeper, right? And every philosopher has their own version of this, right? And yes, it can be annoying, but one of the things that philosophy is really good at is getting you to realize that people often have very different definitions or understandings of what a word means. And if you start talking with them about it, you start talking about what freedom means to when you're having a political discussion with someone, your Democrat or Republican friend, right? You start talking about what love or what cheating really is with your partner, right? You'll quickly find out that not only do people have very different understandings of what words mean, but those disagreements have consequences, right? So anyways, that's a sort of general point about philosophy. But that's my way of saying, okay, I ask you what something is, or whether you like it or not, if you identify with it or not. But always the philosopher has to go, oh, wait a second, we forgot to define the term first. Before we go any further, we always want to define our terms. So now, again, you'll pause the recording and say, okay, but what is a feminist, right? We're going to backtrack and now ask the first question, okay? Define a feminist. So, put up what defines a feminist. Now, you can give 2 kinds of definitions here. One is what you think of when you think of a feminist. Okay? So how you would categorize or define a feminist. You can also give, I guess I'd keep these separate, right? I'd mark them, which one is which. How you think other people define a feminist. Now, these might be basically the same, right? Like if you define the Yankees as the best baseball team in the history of baseball, lots of people are going to have the same, other people are going to have the same definition, right? I'm not a huge Yankees fan, but you know what I mean? There's plenty of them. Okay. Now, they might be different, they might be the same. Okay. So now we want you to list what you think defines a feminist for yourself and what, if there's any difference, how you think other people define it. Now in a physical classroom, I'd walk up on the board, and I'd have you read these out, and I'd put them all up on the board. Okay. What we're going to do instead is the discussion board is this one might operate a little differently than some of our other ones. We're going to get people saying whether they are or not a feminist, whether they are or not consider themselves to be a feminist. Then we're also going to get a list of things that people think what feminism means. Now, every class is different. Remember, we're existentialists while we're doing Beauvoir, so that means every individual is different, not even just every class. So I honestly don't know what you'll say. I'm always pleasantly surprised by my students. but I can speak in general outlines of what I think will happen. Okay? And that's what's going to lead into the next question. Okay? When you see this list, so you're going to have to revisit this page maybe after you post your own stuff, like the next day, to see what other people post. Okay? When you look at the list generated of what your fellow students think feminism is for themselves and what people seem to define it as in the culture in general, then you're going to answer the third part of our question, which is, what do you think of that list, right? Which of the things seem good or bad to you? Which of the things seem like your definition of feminism? Which of them seem good or bad definitions? Maybe we shouldn't say good or bad, but accurate reflections of what feminism is. So here we'll have a discussion about the very different understandings of what feminism is. Now, I want you to say what you think in that, sort of independently about what I'm about to say next. Often what happens, though, is, like I said, not too many people raise their hands and declare, yeah, I identify as a feminist. I consider myself a feminist. Then what happens is we put things on the board, and some of them are things that nobody would identify as. Like, does anyone in the class identify as a man-hater? Probably not, and I hope not. I'm a man. Also, it just wouldn't be nice in general. But then there's other things like equal legal rights for women. Now, even if I might include other things under a feminist, I'd certainly include that under a feminist myself. But that's nothing objectionable. So the point is, if feminist means I support equal legal rights for women, that men and women have equal legal rights, then we're probably all feminists. Now, if it's man-hater, then probably none of us are feminists. Right? So there's a few things I'm trying to do here. And again, I want you all to sort this out and have your own discussion on the discussion board. But what I often see students thinking about in response to this is it gets them seeing how important it is to have definitions. Because if you mean by feminist man-hater, and then you ask someone why they're a feminist, and they mean by feminist equal legal rights for women, even before the conversation starts, you two have a misunderstanding. So of course the conversation is probably not going to end with great enlightenment and warm fuzzies on all sides. It's probably going to get off to a bad start and only get worse. But why? Not because you disagree, but because you misunderstood each other. Okay? That's one point that often comes out of this. A second one is, like other things, there might be many different kinds of feminism. Some people say feminism is equal respect for women. Well, respect and legal rights are very different things. Okay? Like, I respect most people who are 17, but I don't support them having identical legal rights to 19-year-olds, the age of majority. Okay? So, there might be different kinds of feminism, just like there's different kinds of Democrats, right? There's union Democrats, there's socially liberal Democrats, there's different kinds of Republicans, there's socially conservative Republicans, there's libertarian free market Republicans, right? So that's just something to think about too. Maybe you're one kind of feminist and not the other kinds. Okay? So again, the general importance of getting our definitions at least clear to ourselves and stated to other people when we're talking to them is one point. Second one is if you don't identify as a feminist, maybe it just means you haven't found your feminist yet. Like the kind of feminist that you that makes good sense to you. And what that means, transition into the actual reading, is that maybe Beauvoir is your kind of feminist. Remember, I've said a little bit so far about what Beauvoir is about. She's about freedom. She's about saying every individual is a unique expression of freedom, and every individual should be allowed to express their freedom how they want. And we shouldn't hold anybody back by saying men don't do that, or men have to do that, or women, it's not feminine if you do that, you shouldn't do that, or, yeah, women have to do X, Y, and Z. Nobody should be subjected to that. Well, at that level of Beauvoir, I can pretty much guarantee you're all that kind of feminist, right? So, part of this is it's the same when philosophy teachers teach Marx. You all know something about Karl Marx already. He's a communist. You already have in your head a definition of communism. And for most of you, it's something very bad. Just like for a lot of you, feminism is not some great thing. But we might have different definitions of it. And we basically don't want to prejudge the work because we have some definition in our head that might not actually apply to the book. So you are allowed to totally dislike Beauvoir. She very well could be wrong about everything. She is exactly as likely to be wrong about everything as every other philosopher we read. So we don't want to go in prejudging it and sort of spoiling the reading for ourselves, because there might be lots of things you'd like in this text, but if you go in saying, well, she said she's a feminist, I'm not a feminist, or I've heard bad things about feminism, you might miss out on some of the stuff that you could use in your own life, even if you don't end up ever identifying with a feminist or agreeing with Beauvoir. Okay? And that's also a general point we want to hold out for all these readings. Okay? I see students a lot of times saying, yeah, but such and such was written so long ago, no wonder they said such crazy stuff. Okay, first of all, there's people writing today who say crazy stuff too. So if the explanation is maybe that made sense in their day but not in ours, does that mean you accept everything that's being written in your own day? I mean, that's the logic that people use when they say, well, it's written a long time ago, that's why it doesn't make sense. Also, for those of you who are religious, all the religious texts were written a long time ago, and yet you think they make sense. So same thing. We don't want to prejudge a work by being old, that there's something guaranteed to be outdated about it. We don't want to judge someone as being a different religion than us, that they might not get ethics or morality, and we don't want to judge someone by what ism we think they belong to, existentialism, feminism, communism, republicanism, what have you, as being sort of dead in the water, wrong already. Okay. So, to the reading. Remember, I've already said a few times that freedom's the only thing Beauvoir cares about. In fact, the only reason she cares about feminism is not because she's a woman, but because she thinks there's a question of freedom at stake here. So the place in our book where she says that most clearly is pages 16 to 17. If you have the older edition, you need to look at the syllabus or contact me to see the other page numbers. This is why it's important to have the assigned edition. Okay, but 16 and 17 is where she talks about this freedom that I keep referring to and why it's so important. Okay? But let's go to the text itself. So Beauvoir says some interesting things in the first few pages. On the first page, she says, I've waited a long time to write a book about being a woman, a book on feminism, as it'll turn out. And she says, why? Well, she says, the question sort of bores and irritates me. Why does it bore and irritate her? She says, no one asks a man to write a question, to answer the question, what does it mean to be a man specifically? So she says, being a man seems to be sort of transparent. We all already know what it means to be a man. Okay, and you go over to page 5 and she sort of explains that more. She says, we know what it means to be a man, and therefore nobody's asked to write a book about it, because all it means is to be a human being. So in French, in English, sort of in German, and lots of languages, if you talk about humanity in general, you just use the word that also means men, like male human beings in general. So I could say in English, man was put on this earth to do one thing, procreate and glorify God, right? Okay, well, man by themselves cannot procreate, right? But you could say that and no one would be like, whoa, what's he talking about? You'd know I meant humanity in general. I could also say, please don't ever start your papers this way. Since the dawn of time, man has contemplated issues of ethics and morality, and we see that in Plato, Aristotle, and Beauvoir. I wouldn't think by that you meant only dudes have contemplated, right? Only bros sit around the campfire and contemplate ethics and morality. No, I know you mean all of humanity. And in French, which is Beauvoir's native language, it's the same. In German, they have two different words, but One of them is mensch, which does mean men, right? That's where the English word men comes from. The point is this. If I'm telling you a story just about generic people, so I walk into this store and I'm looking around for the bathroom because I just need to use the bathroom and I don't want to buy anything, right? And then the manager sees me and says, can I help you? And then I get all embarrassed. Okay, I tell you that story. How do you picture the manager? Well, in the American context, I think most of us would picture a white man, right? Now, maybe you didn't, right? Maybe you didn't. But I think a lot of us, there's a generic story and the person says they, or it's a single person, but you just name like the job they have instead of he, she, our minds sort of fill in a fuzzy picture of the scene, and the face in the fuzzy picture is a generic human male face. It's a man. Now, Beauvoir thinks that these things are telling, right? You could say, well, it's just arbitrary, it's just my imagination, I'm picturing someone. But do any of us just automatically fill in all the unknown people? Like if I name check some philosopher that you've never heard of, or I talk about someone in my family, if I say, oh, my cousin, what a handful. Do any of us automatically picture women and girls for all these unknown people? No, I don't think so. Okay. Her point is this. Men are defined as just human. So she says it's not actually that there's two poles of humanity and men are on one side and women on the other. Like that's probably how it sort of seems. You've got really masculine guys on one side, really feminine women on the other, and maybe sort of, people in between closer to this 0 point of generic humanity. She says actually, whether we realize it or not, in the middle, where it should just be neutral generic humanity, that's identified with men, and men are identified with that. So think about it. Try to define what makes a man. Not what makes a good man, but just what makes a man a man. It's, I don't know. It's supposed to be difficult. I mean, I'm trying to come up with something and not really doing a good job of it. But Beauvoir's point is that, yeah, it's hard to define because all you think of when you think of generic male of the species is just a human. Okay, he can talk. He has free will, so he can move around in a way objects can't. He's rational, so he can think about things and figure things out. That may have some connection to his freedom. It may also have some connection to his ability to speak. Yeah, so that's what it is. A walking, talking, self-moving, smart animal. That's what a human being is. Or sorry, that's what a male is. A generic male. Okay. Now she says try to define what a woman is. And all of a sudden we get this whole list of particular things. Well, women can have babies. Women are weaker than men. Right? What else? Women are more emotional, right? So they're the fairer sex is what it sometimes said, F-A-I-R-E-R, like more fair, the fairer sex. They're gentler, they're more moral, they're self-sacrificial, right? And we could say, no, this is stuff, yeah, there'll be exceptions, but this is what women are in general. So her idea here is that when you think of what just that, like, not even the average guy, but like man as such, or masculinity is. Maybe not masculinity. There's just no difference between it and humanity in general. And those are all good things, right? To be able to speak, have free will, to be rational. Those are all good things. Or they're at least neutral and tend to be used well. When we try to define what a woman is, or what femininity is, it's a bunch of really specific things. And most of them aren't so hot, right? Okay, women can carry children. That's actually pretty impressive. On the other hand, it also means they have to. If I could have a child with either carrying it or not, frankly, I'd rather not have to carry it. Women are more emotional than men, so we say. Well, I like my emotions, but I like them the way they are. I'd rather not have more sadness, more depression, more frustration, right? I like it just the way it is. More loving, more gentle, more sacrificial, same thing. Like, I'd rather be loved and get sacrifices than be the person who's defined by that. Now, it might sound selfish, but if you disagree, then please stop refusing kindness and sacrifices from your parents. Not going to happen, right? Or from your significant other. Okay. Now, that's not the best example, but we'll improve on that example as we go on in the book. Okay. This is what Beauvoir says. When we think of what men are and what they should be, basically, we define them as human. That is, we define them as freedom. That is, we don't really define them. We let individual men, Johnny and Frankie and Javier and Doug, right? We let them define themselves. Javier wants to be a nuclear physicist. Go, Javier, that's badass. Doug wants to be a drummer. Also badass, Doug. Good for you. Okay? And then you're either a good drummer or a bad drummer. Doug's actually not very good. Okay? But it's still Doug's choice. It comes down to Doug being Doug, why he's a bad drummer. It comes down to Javier being Javier, that's why he's a good nuclear physicist. But with women, and this is never absolute, it's always ambiguous, right? We still say Joni, Juliet, Henrietta. Yes, go choose. Go do whatever you want to do, right? But if Henrietta goes on to be a nuclear physicist, we'll definitely notice that. Oh, that's an unusual choice for a woman. If she goes on to be a mother, though, are any of you going to bat an eye at Henrietta being a mother and having kids? No, because that's what women do that. Right? So, okay, a little pause here. These are all very big generalities, right? Okay, understand they are generalities. And as good philosophers in training, you should notice when things are what are called truisms, where they're true because they're so general. Like, oh, the weather here, it's blah, 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 right? They're true-ish. That's what a truism means. They're true-ish because they're so general, but that means they're not really true. So what I want you to do every time I say something is, it's not exactly like, oh, rush to find a counterexample, but acknowledge that there will be counterexamples, and then just ask yourself, can you find examples like that in your own life? If you just really, really have to stretch to find examples like that in your own life, then maybe it's not great support for Beauvoir's point. Maybe she could have found a better support, or maybe her point just doesn't work. But if you can find your own sort of examples pretty easily, then even though there will always be counterexamples, right, then there's something to the point she's making. And remember, another point before we get too far into Beauvoir's reading. Her point here in the second sex ties into her other work. And her other work says, human beings are free. Our ethical goal as human beings is to enhance and protect our own individual freedom, and to help protect and enhance the individual freedom of other people. So the one general way to be unethical or to be bad is to limit or not help protect and enhance someone else's freedom. And you can also do that to yourself, which is also bad. So for every single individual example she'll give, even though there's always going to be an exception to it, if in general the pattern holds up that what we say about women is that they're free but they're less free than men, if what we expect of women is that they will make their own decisions but that they need help making their own decisions, or that they won't make as good of decisions as men, or that their decisions are sometimes guided by their body, the fact that they can carry children, or dictated by their emotions, which they don't have complete control over, etc., then the general pattern, even though there's exceptions, is that we're treating women as if they're human, free, but also as if they're not fully human, that is, not fully free. That's the one thing Beauvoir says is off limits to do to another human being. Okay, so the fact that many languages treat the word for male of the species and humanity in general as the same is not in itself a big deal. Okay, and Beauvoir knows that. That men often hold car doors and building doors open for women is not in and of itself a big deal. And in fact, if they were the only things that fit this pattern that happen in the world, they would literally not matter at all. But what happens is when we look at the general ways that we treat women and the general ways in which women treat themselves, there's consistently a presumption that women are or should be a little bit less free than men. That's what we have to keep an eye out for. Okay, we're looking for the general patterns of our culture, not to find, well, my aunt doesn't act that way, or I would never do that to a woman, or, well, not everyone thinks that. That's true, that's valid. But she's not saying these are ironclad laws like gravity. She's saying, watch for the general pattern and tell me whether you agree or not that in our culture, women are treated as free, but a little bit less free than men. Okay? So just one example of this we see on page 5. She says, women are often said to be sort of defined by their ovaries, which is imputed to them as a limitation, right? It's not said to give them like superpowers, but that it's basically that, think about it, around the time when a woman has her period, a few days before her period, she's said to be PMSing. Her brain is supposed to be scattered. Her emotions are supposed to be way more intense and way out of her control. And we say like, oh, you got to avoid her. She's really on a tear. And, when there's, say, like a woman running for high political office, we'll say, well, I hope she's not near the nuclear buttons when she's on her period. Right? Now, Beauvoir says, okay, she's not even going to deny that our bodies do affect our freedom. If you're not particularly tall like myself, you can use your freedom however you want. You probably have a built-in limitation where you're not going to dunk a basketball and be in the NBA. Sorry. Okay, so she admits that bodies can shape or limit freedom. But she says, look at the cultural pattern. We point to women's ovaries and say that's a limitation. It makes them less rational, at least some of the time, more emotional, at least some of the time, and it's going to make them later on want to have children at a certain point. That's the biological clock, right? Whereas men get to choose whether they want to have kids or not. But she says what we conveniently forget there is that in male bodies, the equivalent to female ovaries are the testicles. Literally, these are the exact same parts when you're a young fetus, and they only develop into the different organs as you get older. Okay? And they both produce certain gender, sex-based hormones like, they have a role to play in producing estrogen and testosterone. Okay? So, Beauvoir will admit that ovaries can influence women's mental state and impact their freedom a few days out of the month before their period. But she says, conveniently, because we're used to looking at women's bodies as a limit on their freedom, biological clock, too emotional, PMS, right? We're sort of primed to look for the ways that their body limits their freedom. What we conveniently forget, she says, is that men also have a body part which limits their freedom, which also produces hormones which distorts the way they think and limits their freedom. Any guesses as to what that might be? It's the testicles. Men act crazy not a few days before their period like women might. Men act crazy 30 days out of the month because their body produces all this testosterone. So by the way, men and women both have estrogen and testosterone. Men just have proportionally more testosterone than estrogen. Women and vice versa have more estrogen than testosterone. So think about your friends. If you've ever had a friend who's gotten into a fist fight, was it a man or a woman or both? I actually used to date a woman and she'd been in more fist fights than I had. But again, there's exceptions to every rule. But tally up the number of your friends who you've known to actually have punched somebody else in the face. For most of us, it'll be more men than women. Also think about, of your friends or of yourself, which gender, male or men or women, do you think is more distracted by sexual thoughts they can't control? Who do you think spends more time in their day getting distracted from things they were planning on doing by thinking about sex? And those are thoughts that you don't control, right? They just come to you, these sexual impulses. Once more, it's a generality, but I'd say I know friends who can't think for a few minutes straight without sex. Some of them are women for sure. I'm not going to name names. Most of them are men. Okay? Same thing. I know guys who've gone to jail because they punched other people. I don't know of any women who've gone to jail because they punched other people. Now, testosterone drives men to do this. Of course, they still have some choice in the matter. Just like women have some choice in the matter when they're on their periods. Beauvoir's point is this. Everybody's body is two things at once. This is the ambiguity of what it means to be a human being. Your body is both a capability, which enhances your freedom, because you can't choose to play basketball if you don't have a body. And it's a non-free fact that sort of makes your freedom difficult. You can choose to stay up for a week straight, but your body won't let you. You can choose not to have sexual thoughts, but your body won't let you. You can choose to try to dunk a basketball, is me being frustrated now, and some of our bodies won't let us. The point is, this is what we do to women. This is our major point in this book, is that we ignore the ways in which men's bodies or decisions limit their own freedom, and we overemphasize the ways in which women's bodies or life experiences, etc., we overemphasize the way in which women's freedom is limited. So it happens to both genders equally. Neither gender can stay up too late at night. Your body makes you sleepy. Right? That happens to all of us. But for so many things, we say, well, this particular woman, Julie, she's doing X, Y, and Z because she's a woman. We move to this general category. And then we say woman, or women in general, have something about them which makes them less free, less rational, less humanly free. Now, we do that sometimes for men. Right? We'll say he's a dog. He just can't help it. He can't control it. Or we'll say he's an alcoholic. His body has addiction problems and he can't help it. Right? He's an opiate addict. He can't help it. But when we do that, we don't say he's an opiate addict because he's a man. But when we say that a woman's unfree, in most cases, not all of them, but in most cases, we say, yeah, it's something to do with her being a woman. Not individual choices she made as an individual human, but something about this, abstract category, the feminine, right? Capital W woman. That means that we don't hold women accountable for their own decisions. It also means we don't let them make quite as many decisions because we feel like they're not fully in control of their own decisions. And that process, whereby we take one group of people and we treat them as a group rather than as distinct individuals, is what Beauvoir on pages 10 and 11 calls the other. So don't think of the other as like a kind of people, in fact. It's actually a process. So it's awkward to say this, but you make someone the other. You can also say that people will other an individual. And if that way of speaking sounds too awkward or forced to you, you can just say when you treat someone else as the other. I would define more or less the other as this. When you acknowledge that a group of people are human and free like the rest of us. Of course, black people are just as smart and hardworking and moral as the rest of us. That's the first part. Yes, women are, of course, just as rational as men are. Who would deny that in this day and age? And the second part is this. You go, ... well, dot, 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 but, dot, dot, dot. And then you add something not about that individual, but about the group that then says, while that group is still free, rational, whatever it may be, they're naturally a little bit less so. So you go, yeah, of course, blacks are just as moral as anybody else. But they do, don't kill the messenger, but they game the welfare system more often than whites do. Remember, this isn't me talking. This is what the process of making someone the other looks like. You go, yes, of course, women are just as moral and rational as men. Dot, dot, dot. But, women are duplicitous. Women can put on one face and then talk about you behind your back. That's why they gossip so much. Right? Again, this isn't me talking. And the point is, probably most of you wouldn't say those exact things quite so directly. But who do you think is more likely to gossip, a man or a woman? Why do you think that is? You think it's just coincidence? If you think it has something to do with women being women, then it might be the kind of thing Beauvoir is talking about. Okay? So, I'm not going to run through all the details of the introduction. Now, maybe you want me to, because they come really fast in that introduction, don't they? She's just rattling them off. That might be a little overwhelming, but remember, there's a whole big chunk of book that more slowly goes through some of these. So how about this? If you have any questions about some of the things she says in the introduction, any detail, just email me and I'll explain it in detail. Okay, but I've already given you the, so do that. I mean that 100%. Email me about every little detail that you have a question about, this or any other chunk of reading. Okay? Just so you know, though, the key is already there on pages 16 and 17, and these other more general points from Beauvoir's other works about freedom that we've discussed. Okay? If it sounds like she's saying something's bad, she says that as a society, we've sort of fallen into the habit of making women the other. That is, acknowledging that they're free and they're human just like the rest of us, just like the men. But then, thinking that we're just describing how women actually are, we're sort of giving with one hand and taking with the other. That's what it means to treat someone as the other. You give with the one hand, you say, hey, partner, hey, fellow human, glad you're here. And then the other hand, you go, well, but I'll make the decisions. Or, well, but don't, yeah, you're free, but not quite as free as me, as the rest of us guys. Okay. So that's the master key, but often, she references Stendhal or Freud or Marx or this concept. She uses Latin sometimes. It can be hard to see what she's getting at because she's trying to summarize the whole book in the introduction. That's what introductions do. So I've given you the master key, but it can be very hard to figure out how to use it in this first chapter or this first introduction. So absolutely ask me any questions if you want to hear more about some detail. They're all pretty interesting. Okay, thank you everyone.